Hi, and welcome again to Off the Page. I'm Leslie Choice. My guest today has written about 12 books, I believe, for adults and for young adults and for little kids as well. His name is Kevin Major. Hi, Kevin. Welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
When did you start writing?
Well, if you go back far enough, I probably did a little bit in school, although I was not the type of writer that, spent my youth putting things together on the page. Seriously, when I started, I started off thinking I was going to be a doctor, and I changed my mind partway through. And then in my years teaching, my beginning years teaching, I started to think seriously about trying to get published. So this goes all back to about the mid-70s.
The teaching drove you to it, or it enticed you into writing because you were learning about the kids that you were working with?
Partly, yeah. I mean, what it did was focus my attention on writing books that had a particular interest level, that I was teaching junior high kids. I was seeing that there weren't very many books that really portrayed them as I thought, or as I knew that they were. So I was interested in writing something pretty up to date and using their language and their things that they were interested in. So that's what drove me to write. Holdfast was the first one.
It's intriguing that even though your books are set in very local places in Newfoundland, that they found national, international audiences. That certainly didn't seem to be a barrier in any particular way, that you were writing about a place far off the mainstream. Why do you think that worked out so well for you?
Well, I think a good piece of writing does focus in on a particular locale and tries to capture that place. But you attempt to do it in such a way that it transcends that area, as you said. And obviously with writing, you're writing about the human condition, and that's pretty universal. I've seen some Newfoundland writing that probably wouldn't transport very well because it's maybe a bit too localized, in terms of language and so on, and the undercurrents weren't probably being perceived in other places. So that's pretty regional, but I've tried to expand it. Keep the flavor of Newfoundland, the images of Newfoundland certainly, but broaden the scope a bit. So maybe it would be of interest to people in other places.
You write about contemporary kids, or maybe 11, 12, 13, 14, something like that. What were you interested in at that age? Were you a good student?
Well, I have to admit I was a pretty good student. I shouldn't say I have to admit. I was, I guess, pretty proud of the fact that I did pretty well in school. I liked writing, but as I said, I wasn't compelled to spend my time at it. It was something that I sort of did on the side, and there were some teachers that said, yeah, you have a talent for writing. And I do remember one teacher in grade 10 saying that someday he thought I would write a book. So maybe that stuck with me.
That voice
that's,
in your
yeah,
head.
And obviously in the embarrassing position of having your piece read out to the whole class.
Oh. And then all the other kids looking kind of funny at you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and so I thought I had a way with words. My first effort in terms of trying to write a novel didn't meet with success. It was rejected by probably a dozen different publishers. And
well, that was good for you.
Yeah, that was good for it. And I shelved it and went on.
Yeah. Now, your first published book, if I have it right, was Holdfast.
Was Holdfast, yeah. And
in a sense, you burst onto the scene, as they say. It was a very successful book. How did that happen?
Well, I think, it was at the time where books about young people were starting to take a different feel and different tact. And you had books coming out of the States like The Outsiders, and a similar vein coming out of England, in which teenagers were pretty up to date, and they were dealing with problems, divorce or drugs or whatever, and they weren't the old style adventure books, mystery books. They had a bit of an edge to them. So I think people in Canada maybe were looking for a bit of that to come out of our own country. And I can think of only one book before Holdfast that really fit in that category. So in that way, it was something new, it was something different, maybe something people were looking for. I think it's a well-written book, and I like what it tries to say, and I think obviously that was going for it as well.
So the elements of realism is what kids wanted and what teachers needed even in the
It also
classroom.
came with a bit of controversy over time. There were people who took issue with the fact that there was swearing in the book at times. Or
Tell me about that. I was going to ask you next about the conflicts that have arisen over the years, over the nature of your novels.
Yeah. That book in particular seemed to be the focus of it, but the few books that came after probably had a bit stronger language in it. People liked the story, liked what I was saying, but as I said, they didn't like the fact that occasionally the main character swore, or the uncle swore in the book, or that Michael dared to think about sex, even though he was 14. And in some ways it sort of, for me, because it kept being an issue that people came back to, took away from what I thought, or what I would have liked them to focus on, which was the writing.
What was happening? I mean, were teachers, or some teachers, or some librarians, or some parents actually protesting to the school about using it?
Well, various things happened. Sometimes the book was attempted to be used in schools, and parents objected, and it was withdrawn. Occasionally I would be asked to to do a reading in a school, and then principal would read the book beforehand, and somehow the
Better not allow him here.
reading would suddenly be canceled.
Corrupting the minds of youth.
As opposed to that, there were a lot of people who were really enthusiastic about it, and I went into lots of schools, and the book was adopted for schools in lots of places, and in Nova Scotia being one of them. And I was getting a tremendous amount of positive feedback. But, as you know, in the world of book censorship, it really only takes one person to create a stir, and then, people pick up on it. And
Did you take it personally, though, or did you know it was the nature of the medium?
Well, I had the reaction at the beginning saying, you're going to have to expect maybe some of this, and it obviously was happening to other books in other places. I just didn't like the fact that it sort of became a bit tiresome for me over the years. It became the focus of some of the books, and so
you had moved on, and you knew that wasn't the significant element of your writing.
And it's obviously not the big issue that it was years ago.
Yes. You were a teacher for many years and teaching during the time that some of your books were being published. How did your kids react, your students? What did they think of their teacher?
Well, I had given up full-time teaching by that time, but I was still doing supply, substitute teaching, and they sort of thought it was neat that their teacher would occasionally make appearance on television, or there were the books in the library that I wrote.
Did they read your books?
I think lots of them did. I don't think I probably there were lots more I didn't reach, so to speak. But it was kind of fun. It was kind of fun living in the place that, in a sense, you are writing about.
Yes.
It was a small town, a small outport in Newfoundland. And the name was changed in the book, but it had a lot of things, obviously, in common with the fictionalized place. They perhaps did things like trying to find characters that might be identifiable in the book, and I was careful about that. I didn't create a character just like any one person.
That can be a very dangerous sort of thing. Now, your latest book, A to Z, is quite different from these YA novels. It's for younger readers. It has lots of pictures, and it deals with cultural roots of Canadians. How did that come about?
Well, I'd gotten into publishing more young children's books, picture books, I guess we tend to call them. And I had encountered a book published years ago, maybe 100 years ago, called The Shaker, ABC Darius, which was a book that the Shakers, the religious group from the U.S., had published for the children to learn the alphabet. And basically they came up with 4 words for each letter of the alphabet. The end words rhymed, and the beginning word was the necessary word in the alphabet. So it was a way of teaching the kids, I guess, a bit about animals, because they were all animals, and a little bit about the alphabet and how it's structured. So that was sort of the stirring point, I guess you would call. So I thought, well, I'd like to try this, because I'm sort of, any writer likes to have fun with words. So this would be a Canadian book, all Canadian words, or all Canadian connected words. And not only would the first word of each quartet be that particular letter of the alphabet, but all 4 words would be. So it became a bigger challenge in a way. The N words would rhyme. There would be a certain rhythm and rhyme to the whole thing. I wanted to have at least one place name for every province and territory in the country. And I wanted to try to pick words that maybe didn't necessarily spring to mind when we think of Canada, that I avoided, you know.
And that's why we're going to ask you to read that poem, which is actually becomes the basis for the entire book there, with lots of great visual stuff all together. But
Yeah.
you're going to take us A to Z and lead us through the story of the alphabet.
Well, there's a whole section in the back of the book that talks about each word, and that was a way of, I guess, informing people a little bit more about the words that I had chosen. So we start off with A. Arctic, apple, aurora, annick, bunum, blue nose, beaver, bannock. Canadarm, Cavendish, chinook, caribou, dory, dinosaur, dulce, Dan McGrew. Evangeline, evergreen, A, expo, fleur-de-lis, fiddlehead, fox, fogo. Gould, Gretzky, green, grizzly bear, habitant, horseshoe, humpback, hare. IMAX, insulin, Iqaluit, ice blind, J, Jasper, Juno, jackpine. Klondike, Comatic, Kittiwake, kayak, loon, lacrosse, lillooet, lumberjack. Maple, moose, McClung, Mountie, Nipawin, narwhal, nickel, Napanee. Ogopogo, Ottawa, oil, osprey, Peterson, potlatch, poutine, Persay. Quahog, quarter horse, Quinnsquab, Pell, Rockies, railway, rodeo, riel. Shediac, sockeye, spud, Saint-Hubert, Tuktoyak, toque, totem, tortillere. Angava, Umiak, uranium, ulu, Voyager, Villeneuve, Viking, Vandu. Wheat, walleye, wawa, waxwing, xenon, xylograph, cross-country, crossing. Yarmouth, yoho, York yellowhead, Zamboni, zipper, zinc, zed.
Thank you. Can we trust you that you pronounce all those words correctly?
Well, I hope so.
Yeah, that would be a bit challenging for little kids to read those words,
Yeah.
but sometimes that's what
Yeah,
writers
well,
need to do, right? Is not
Right,
just
yeah.
give simple
And
stories.
I thought of the book not only for young kids, and because I think I give this book to adults, and they're sort of intrigued because it's words that they don't know, or if they know the word, they think, well, what is the Canadian connection here? You know, why do you have zipper in? Well, zipper was invented by a Canadian.
Oh, really? I
And,
didn't know that.
and it used to be called the Talon slide fastener.
Mhm.
So in the back of the book I said, they changed the name because you couldn't say your Talon slide fastener is down. A bit of a mouthful.
And it helped to take you into Zed there.
Yeah.
Which guys.
That's right.
Okay, Kevin, what book are you most proud of all the books that you've written? I know it's a dangerous thing to ask the writer because
Yeah.
you like to say these are all my
Well, I don't know if I
ones.
could pick out one, but there are a few that are special to me, in part because of the time I had trying to get them published,
Yes.
I think, and then the reaction afterward. Hold Fast, because it was the first one.
Mhm.
You know, you make this commitment to writing, you write something, gets rejected. Do you stick with it, or do you believe that you don't have the capabilities to write a good book? So that and the initial reaction to it, which was generally very positive, and I do like what I have to say there. House of Wooden Santas, which has turned out to be a really popular book, went through 5 publishers before we found somebody willing to take it on, and you know, I had published 10 books up to that point. And
But it was still a challenge.
You're
and
you're sort of thinking, yeah,
It's embarrassing.
there's a door open here. Somebody should let me in. And I really believed in the book, and they came, the four publishers that rejected it came with all sorts of reasons why it wouldn't work.
Yes, publishers always have reasons. So we're going to take a
As
short
you-
break right now,
Okay.
but we'll get back to the story. My guest today is Kevin Major, and we'll be back right after this. And welcome back to Off the Page. My guest today is Kevin Major. Kevin, you were involved in a book project with 12-year-old Ontario boy named Craig Kielburger. What was his impact on the world?
Well, I think a lot of Canadians will remember Craig from the time that he was, as a 12 and 13-year-old, going around the third world and having encountered Prime Minister Chrétien and confronted him about the issue of child labor. And they'll remember that episode several years ago, and the two meeting and sort of the whole media hoopla, and Craig came back somewhat of a hero.
This was just a regular little kid from
Well,
suburban Ontario
his
who
story,
read an article?
his story in itself is entirely fascinating. He became, as a lot of young kids do, interested in the issue, but he decided he wanted to do something about it.
The issue in particular being children working in industries.
Children
throughout the world.
in the third world working in industries or farms, for that matter, and being, in lots of cases, being exploited. So kids having to give up school to go out and earn some money for the family, basically. And he was just appalled at the fact that there are approximately 250 million kids in the world doing that, having to do that. So he ended up going, because he kept talking about it to different people and talking to his friends about it, and he wanted to see it for himself. And basically that's what the story revolves around, this trip which he took through several places, India, Pakistan, Nepal, and various countries in that part of the world.
Yeah, he certainly drew at least Canadians' attention to this issue.
Yeah,
we all sort of knew this was going on.
Yeah.
Of course, it still does go on. But how did he achieve so much notoriety and actually bring attention to the issue?
I think because, in large measure, it was because he was young himself. That was a fascinating story for the media. But people quickly saw that this just wasn't any kid going over there and getting outraged, that he started to learn more about it and could talk from a really informed perspective. And he came back and he started a group called Free the Children. And now that has hundreds of branches all over the world. And they raise money and undertake projects. They build schools in India, and they undertake literacy projects and things. And they try to make a difference, which indeed they have. But I think his biggest impact has been that he's created people's awareness of the issue. And it's a complex issue. It's not just a matter of taking those kids out of those situations. Often they're there for family support.
How bad is that global situation still today with child labor?
Well, it's still very prevalent. I don't know if it's less prevalent than when Craig was involved in it at the beginning stages, but he certainly raised people's awareness of the issue and raised it to the level that countries involved were taking a second look and trying to come up with ways to alleviate the problem. So when he came back from Canada, people were after him sort of to write the story and to get the story out in a printed form. And he sort of put it off for several years and eventually decided, yeah, this would help spread the word in a sense. What
was your involvement with the book project?
Well, I came in as sort of a co-writer. It wasn't the type of book that, some people think that he had the story, I just took the story and rewrote it. That basically didn't happen. He spent a lot of time getting his thoughts down on paper. But he wasn't a professional writer, and he was also still only 15, and I could bring a certain amount of organization to the whole project. So he would spend long hours writing. I was in Newfoundland, he was in Toronto. I met him just once, and we would basically communicate by telephone and fax, and he would send me all he had written, and I would take it and maybe reorganize it a bit and polish it up in terms of the writing, and send it back to him. And you know, we had long times on the phone. We would literally spend 5 or 6 hours some days on the phone talking.
Must have been quite an involving experience for yourself.
Well, for me it was
educated
an
about that
eye-opener to see that this thing was going on. And what made it difficult, I guess from a writing perspective, that it was really concentrated. They had this deadline to meet in terms of a publisher wanting it out by a certain time. And basically the book was put together in about 2.5 months.
Yeah. Another one of your books, very, very different. You have a great variety of skills in different areas of writing. You wrote a novel for adults about World War I, No Man's Land. What happened in France on that morning of July 1st, 1916 that led you to create a novel?
Well, this is a historical novel. Anybody knows Newfoundland history knows that there was one particular battle that really became the focus of Newfoundland's involvement in World War I. At the time, of course, we were a separate country. We weren't part of Canada. A part of a much bigger battle, the Battle of the Somme, and generally considered the most tragic incident in Newfoundland history. And the morning of July 1st, 1916, 800 men of the Newfoundland Regiment went into battle, and in the space of an hour, there were only 68 left who were neither killed nor wounded. Horrendous undertaking.
And you suggest that because of those numbers of deaths and the fact that everyone was from Newfoundland, that the impact was felt throughout the island.
Well, you know, Newfoundland was only had 250,000 people at the time. There were over 250 killed. And one in every 1,000 Newfoundlanders lost their life in the space of an hour, which is, and there was no place in Newfoundland that wasn't affected by it. If you didn't have somebody in your family who was killed, you obviously knew somebody who was. Or somebody up the street had a son die or a husband. So it had impact right throughout the whole of society, and came to represent a lot in Newfoundland about a growing society and obviously about the impact of war. After the war, the Newfoundland government took hold of this land, purchased all the land on which the battle took place in northeastern France, and kept it as a memorial, which is today. And you can go there and see the trenches still, see where all these people died, see some of the grave stones of the Newfoundland, the Newfoundland names. And I went there and it was just a tremendously moving experience. As anybody who visits, of course, the graveyards, whether they be Vimy Ridge or Passchendaele or any of them from the Canadian perspective. But this Battle of Beaumont-Hamel became a really flashpoint for Newfoundlanders.
Okay, thanks for that, Kevin. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back with Kevin Major right after this. You've been watching Off the Page today. My guest is Kevin Major. Kevin, what are the big challenges for writers who are writing for kids in Canada today?
Well, I think you write with kids. You don't write down to them, and I think that's a mistake a lot of authors make. They sort of see their audience down there somewhere, and even when you're writing for small kids, young kids, you got to be there. You got to be there and give them the respect that they deserve. So I think that's sort of the key element.
And if you have a teenager who comes up to you and says, give me some advice here, I want to be a writer like you.
What I say to them is, you're probably going to, if you are going to be a writer, you're going to probably be a writer in your 20s or 30s. And there's a lot of things you're going to have to go through and learn and do something else if you want to. But if you're a true writer, you'll always come back to it.
You stick to it. Kevin Major, thanks for being on the show. And thanks for watching Off the Page. I'll see you again next time.